thank you for all attending indeed. Yes, this is the second Global Enhanced Mineralization Conference, but after I thought that it is actually the third. So you see, this is quite blurry because we even can count. Organized by Sven, Lense, Linda, Ingrid, Smet, Patricia, and myself. I will briefly explain about the history. This is a very young field. The first publication I found is from Seyfried from 1990. I tried to reach Mr. Seyfried, but I couldn't reach him anymore. And in Holland, but I think also internationally, Olaf Schuiling spent quite some work on this new field. And so therefore, we would like to have the Olaf Schuiling Prize be announced this evening. And after I made a few slides of some previous conferences in 2012. Jos Vink and myself and some other people organized a special Olivine conference. At that time, we had problem with getting sufficiently speakers. Now it has changed completely the last couple of years. In 2016, there was already a big increase. The American Geophysical Union had a special weekend about carbon mineralization. At that time, it was about 30 people joining. And then slowly more attention rose towards mineralization. In 2018, a special report about mineralization. Most people are aware of that, but it focuses at the putting olivine or minerals in a chemical reactor and not putting it outside, as we will discuss today. And last year we had a first olivine conference, and today our second. There was some questions asked about accelerated mineralization. Olivine you can do, I usually say, on two ways, either using that ambient conditions, so putting it into soil or on beaches or in other applications, or you can put it in the chemical reactor. People interested in the latter are invited for next week. There's a conference about accelerated carbonization that is also mainly on internet or completely on internet, so please join that. And there is more and more talks about negative CO2 emissions. At the Gothenburg in 2018, there were some talks about olivine, not that many, but I'm sure at the Goldsmith in a few months, there are a few sessions about mineralization, and quite some people presenting today will be also presenting over there. And you will notice at the American and European Geophysical Union, there are various sessions about that. So there is more attention to that, that's for sure. Some very brief organization items. There are 15 researchers speaking. The whole idea of this Dutch afternoon is about having the speakers being able to explain their research. So the focus of this afternoon is about research. As there are so many people, there is a limited time, but the goal is not to explain as much as your research as you probably can as a researcher, but to explain what you're doing and to get people aware of your research. And this will be recorded if you agreed, so people can look back at it. If not, then we can stop the recording. And I would like to have the presentation shared at the end of the day, but that's something we can discuss. And this evening will be about how to scale this up. So less about science, but more about how to make the business, what are the legal frameworks, and how to get this moving, how to get it out of the lab into the real world, I usually say. The program, I'm sure you all saw by now. We grouped it into a few items. We made a few exceptions, especially Lennart, because he's joining from Australia, and it was already quite late over there. But the rest we put into mine tailings, coastal and terrestrial. And then the last, I would say, to open it, to start on time indeed, yes. In 2012, Van Huffelen opened that. And the most important thing is, let's say, to get things moving. And getting things moving is both about research, but more important even, let's say, get more projects, get more knowledge, get more, get things moving indeed, yes. So that's, and now, as we are still on time, I would like to give the floor to Lennart Bach indeed, yes.
Yes, well, thank you very much for inviting me to give a presentation here. Very exciting, and also thanks for putting me early in the slot, because it's 9:45 now. And I've had a whole day of talking about alkalinity enhancement because we're having a planning workshop for a big project here. So I'm kind of in the zone already, I would say. The title is obviously commencing the assessment, and apologies in advance. Commencing means my project on this has just started this month, so I won't present huge, exciting data and this kind of stuff, more ideas and early work we started with. And because I'm early in the conference, I thought I may as well start, doesn't it work? With a bit of an overview how ocean alkalinity enhancement can actually be achieved. Because there's obviously not just one pathway, there's multiple pathways how to increase alkalinity in the ocean. And I guess the focus in this group here is on olivine minerals. So alkalinity enhancement can be applied you can be mixed with agricultural applications, in which case we usually call it enhanced weathering when it's on land. It can be done by splitting seawater, and that is really a very new thing that just came up, I think last week. It's not even a paper, it's a preprint from some guys at Google who want to split water and then pump the acidity to the bottom, exploiting the natural, the slowness of overturning circulation in the deep ocean and exploit natural weathering down there. And there's obviously coastal enhanced weathering, with which, for example, Project Vesta engages. Then there's CO2 negative hydrogen, so splitting, generating hydrogen and coupling it to speed up weathering reactions, thereby creating, well, hydrogen obviously and alkalinity in order to remove CO2. And then there's simply using ships to spread olivine or other minerals into the open ocean, with the hope that they dissolve fast enough to generate alkalinity and suck up CO2 in the afterwards. So the point here is that the OAE, or ocean alkalinity enhancement perturbation, that is associated with the applied method depends really much on the applied method, and that differs largely between the methods. So I think if you want to assess feasibility and sustainability of all this, you need a relatively broad assessment. So unlike in climate change, where you can perhaps some groups focus on global warming or ocean acidification, it's way more complicated than that because of the multiple ways you could achieve it. Now, going a little bit, focusing a little bit on Australia. Australia, personally, I think is one of the lands, countries, continents that is uniquely positioned to do this. So Australia is a huge, largely dry land. I'm emphasizing dry here because agricultural applications need water, and there is not so much water except for Queensland in the north and Tasmania, where I'm at, in the island in the south. There's a very, very substantial mining expertise here, and the country is all about mining. You realize that once you're here. Australia supplies much of the mineral resources to the world. There's huge solar potential. So this can be seen on this bottom right plot here. Some of the best solar potential in the world. Also the stability with respect to the politics is an advantage in that sense. It does have the ocean access, obviously, but also pristine ecosystems which need to be well preserved. So coming back to the method approach we're having, because obviously when you assess this, you cannot do all of it. So you have to focus on some. And within the Australian context, I think that two among within this list are currently the most, well, where I at least focus on at the moment. So that's agricultural application, even though the land surface area where this would work is not huge, but still the advantage of agricultural applications is obviously the co-benefit that you not only create CDR, but you potentially enhance crop yields, which may be more important to many people than the actual CO2 removal we're interested in. And then the second thing is CO2 negative hydrogen. And in Australia, there's a big push towards hydrogen at the moment. So there's a lot of money going in there, and obviously it's very attractive method in the policy space at the moment. So we're looking at that as well. So what are we working on? Since I didn't have much funding for this until this month, I had to do really basic stuff. And I thought, like, okay, how do we start this? And I think one important component of it is the baseline assessment. So how much alkalinity does currently go into the ocean from land, right? So what I'm basically doing also to get to know the country a little bit better is to travel around as much as I can and take samples from rivers from all over the place. And sorry, I cannot see what's here. Yeah, so it's just simply to get a baseline what the situation is in the pre-alkalinity enhancement world. The beauty of that is that, yeah, sorry. So I designed this as a citizen science project. You can let a citizen sample alkalinity. It's relatively easy. You get many samples very fast and you create awareness. So I think that's a pretty neat blueprint for how this could be expanded. So eventually I want to expand it to the continent, to mainland Australia, and perhaps even elsewhere. But I really think it's important to get that baseline. And I don't think currently we have the data to really know to the level we should know how much alkalinity goes from the land to the oceans. Problem so far, well, first finding for me at least, probably hydrologists would probably not be surprised, but what I saw already is that alkalinity varies hugely from time to time. So we had in the Huon River, which is one of the bigger rivers here, we had in March, we had an alkalinity of 1045, and then in April during a flood, 148. So my vision of a baseline doesn't really work unless you have a continuous monitoring of it. So that brings me to the first conclusion. I think in order to assess and verify alkalinity enhancement in the long run, we need to expand massively on monitoring. Right, so things we're planning. So this is something from a paper I wrote a while ago with a couple of colleagues. And so this is basically the idea that when you use different types of minerals, you obviously add different dissolution products to the ocean, and this will then shift the ecological balance in the ocean. So the hypothesis is that when you use relatively clean minerals such as, well, quicklime, carbonates, and these things, you add alkalinity and calcium, and these benefits mainly calcifiers in the ocean. And then this would be called the white ocean hypothesis. Whereas when you use olivines, you add alkalinity, of course, but also magnesium, silicate, iron, and nickels. And the combined effect of that would, by the hypothesis, lead to stronger growth of cyanobacteria and, for example, diatoms, whereas calcifiers would not benefit from that, which would end up in the green ocean. That's only a hypothesis we want to test, but it would have big implications because obviously when the perturbation changes the ecological balance, that is of a wide interest. And also if you fertilize for calcification indirectly, then also you strip out alkalinity, counteracting the effect you want to achieve. And another thing I've been looking at a lot recently is the Black Sea, because I think the Black Sea can give us a lot of information already. The Black Sea, many of you would probably know, is a high alkalinity marginal sea. So it has already an alkalinity that we're trying to achieve for the future. So or maybe even higher. So the alkalinity currently is 3,200, round about that in the surface. And the pH is something about between 8.3 and 8.4. So it is already something, a perturbed state of the future. And we can have a look at it to see what happens. And the one thing, very, very simple, but I think already a very important insight, is that the simple fact that the Black Sea is not a dead zone. Well, it is a dead zone in the oxygen poor layers at the bottom, but still in its pre-polluted state, it was a healthy ocean. So we can already tell that alkalinity as such is not dangerous to marine life. That might sound trivial to many of you, but I think that's a very, very important point to make to the public in particular. And then the other thing is the Black Sea also harbors some of the largest coccolithophore blooms, which kind of supports this wide ocean hypothesis that alkalinity supports calcification to some extent, which would then counteract the effect of alkalinity addition through biology.
Well, thank you, first of all, the organization for, well, obviously for organizing this. This is really great. You mentioned the 2012 conference, which was a really great kickoff for the olivine concept. And well, a couple of years later now, here we are, the second one. Thanks for inviting me. I hope I can tell you something in the next 10 or 15 minutes about what we are doing. Good afternoon to you all. I'm representing Deltares. For those who don't know our institute, we are a non-profit institute. Deltares actually is a knowledge institute who is doing applied research and using mostly the nature-based solution concepts. And so it started off a couple of years ago, doing some model development, some field experiments, and some simulations for marine environment. And those three pillars I would like to explain to you just briefly, really briefly. Okay, I believe it was in 2015, and I see the first typing error already. We did a SWOT analysis, should be an O in there. SWOT meaning strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and that will be the
Threats.
Threats. Thank you. I was just checking if you were listening. We did this for Climate Kick. Climate Kick is the knowledge innovation community, and we performed a Pathfinder project. And the question there was, is olivine liable for large-scale applications, such as was suggested by Lennart just a few minutes ago? And this SWOT analysis provided us with actually two insights. The major obstructions for large-scale applications of olivine, firstly, are the uncertainty of weathering rates under various conditions, so that is terrestrial and aquatic. And the second one is a really, well, it's a legal obstruction, actually. It's about the nickel content that is within olivine, obviously, because it's from our Earth core. So there's nickel in there. This was actually the starting sign for developing our weathering and sequestration model, which you see on the right-hand side, which we developed with Innovation Concepts at the time, which is represented by Pol, of course, and you see Climate Kick in there as well. Well, let me tell you something about this model, and this, I guess, this is quite important to understand. If you are trying to figure out the weathering rates of olivine, then you should really focus on particle sizes, because that's all about the surface area of olivine that is liable to be weathered, and of course the content of it, the volume. And I'll show you just briefly the concept of the shrinking core model, which is a concept that gives you the opportunity to calculate weathering rates of all various particle sizes. So the whole distribution that is in the amount of olivine that you're applying. Take a look at the graph at the right-hand side, right beneath. There you can see the difference if you calculate weathering rates. We call it monodisperse. Yeah, great, Paul. That's monodisperse. That is when you're calculating with an average grain size, a particle size, or a median, or whatever you are using. And you see what will happen if you're using the actual particle sizes, so the distribution. And you can see that this is a really concave graph, meaning that weathering rates will start off much quicker than you would expect from the monodisperse calculations. Okay, I hope this concept is clear. In the next slide, I will give you a great jump right to the output of the model, which is obviously weathering rates, the amount, which is the graph on the left upper part, which is the olivine dissolved over the years, and the equivalent sequestrated CO2 that goes with that. And of course, there's within this calculation module, if you dissolve olivine, you will also dissolve and release magnesium, and you will also dissolve and release nickel. These calculations are performed within a LCA, that's a life cycle assessment, meaning that the CO2 that has been used up by mining, by grinding and transport is already taken into consideration with this calculation. So you see a net CO2 sequestration. Okay. Well, this is just a model, of course, but a model needs to be at least checked and most preferably be validated. So in the next slide, you will see just a simple photograph, right, which is on our campus in Delft, where we are performing, as we speak, for over a year now, some field experiments we are performing with olivine. What you can see on the background are those are 8 plots which have various treatments, of course, and in the right corner you can see some extra plots which are much more wet because they are close to a water body. Okay, in the next slide I will show you just briefly the concept of these plots, the designs. There is a plot 1 by 1 meter, not much more needed there, which is equipped with pore water samplers. So we're monitoring pore water throughout the year and monitoring the release products such as magnesium, silica, nickel within the pore water of this soil. You can also see a circle in there. It says mesocosm. Well, some people prefer the term lysimeter, but you may also call it a bucket as far as I'm concerned. This is especially done for having a closed system, because when you're performing in field plots, this is really great, of course. It represents ambient conditions, etc., real life, but you are losing mass. You're losing mass through leaching, and you should be able, if you're doing some calculations, you should be able to have a mass balance. So within this mesocosm, you can make sure that you're not losing mass through leaching. Okay. Well, in the next slide, I will show you the look at the green square in there, the treatment variables of these field experiments. We are testing 3 types of minerals, which is the Spanish, the Norwegian olivine, and there's also a calcium silicate in there, that's wollastonite, which we are investigating together with Wageningen University. So that Matilda was present as well. Hi, Matilda. That's what we're testing there. What we're also testing is the different effects of on-top application versus a mixed into the soil application. There are some theories about that, but we want to know the weathering rates, of course, from those two. I briefly explained the dry and the wet conditions that we're looking at, and also the planted and non-planted conditions. Okay, well, the goals you can read there, and you can read it afterwards. I will move on to the next slide then. Okay, here are some really preliminary results. There's a whole bunch of data, of course. After a year, we've been visiting these sites for some occasions. But what is quite interesting, as you may expect, is that the wet plots give a much higher rate of weathering. You can see the orange line. Maybe you can point it out, Paul. The orange line for the Spanish, and below that is the Norwegian. Yes, that's the amount of magnesium that is being released. So from this magnesium concentration, you could calculate back to the raw material, and you can calculate the amount of weathering that has occurred over the time period. Well, you can see that there's quite a gap. Let's say, well, looking through your eyebrows, you can see some factor of 2 difference between the dry and the wet treatments. So this is actually a start of quantifying weathering rates for the Spanish and the magnesium and the Norwegian olivine. Well, for Wollaston Neat, that's even more spectacular. The right graph right there. Thank you, Paul. You can see compared to the reference site that the wet plots are really going in there. They're really weathering, and calcium is being released from the mineral. Okay, another example of some results is the next slide, where I would show you the difference between the on-top application and the mixed-in application. Okay. Well, what is really interesting, and again, you might expect these results. If you look at the mixed in, you can see a much higher weathering rate for the mixed in olivine. The same dose, of course, as the on top. And what we also see is there is some leaching occurring from the 10 centimeter probe to the 40 centimeter. And this is relevant because now we need our mesocosms, of course, to have a complete mass balance. Okay, you're speeding up, that's okay. This is a really important one because the nickel, what you see here is all the data from all the plots, from all the depth, all put together in one graph to show you just how are things going with nickel in pore water. And I would like to focus on the very first left-hand side graph. You can see that, well, the first thing that is obvious, of course, 96% of the nickel pore water measurements that we have done so far is below the analytical limit of quantification. The limit of quantification, as you may know, as an analyst maybe, depends on the composition of the pore water, so it varies a little. But you can see the two dotted lines. This is the range of limit of quantification so far. There's a red line in there as well, which is the environmental quality standard for surface water in Europe, right there. And what anybody can see now is that there are two dots above that. And the two dots are from only the Norwegian olivine. And it only occurs at the really beginning of the experiments. Well, both are really easy to explain so far because the Norwegian olivine has much more nickel in there, about 1.5 factor higher than the Spanish one. And of course, what we're looking at is the really accelerated weathering, as I explained earlier, for the very fine fraction in there. So what we're concluding after, well, there should be some more data in there as well, but I didn't have the time to put it in there. After almost a year of measuring, these are the only two nickel concentration exceedances that we witnessed so far. So that's good news for our main objective to look at nickel in the environment. Some more about that later on. The next, yeah, exactly. Thanks, Paul. What we did is we expanded our calculation model with two modules, nickel risk modules for the terrestrial environment and for the aquatic environment. The terrestrial risk assessment tool is mainly based on nickel speciation in soil. So actually chemical speciation, how does nickel occur in solution and how does it absorb to the soil? And this risk assessment is also expanded with bioconcentration by 33 plant species. The aquatic risk assessment module is also based on dissolved nickel and is based on PNEC, which is the predicted toxicological no effect concentration for nickel. Okay, just a brief explanation on the next slide is that the terrestrial risk module is actually calculating with a numerical geochemical model orchestra in which we calculate nickel speciation in soil and transpose that to a transfer function, as you can see on the right-hand side, to convert concentrations in 33 species of plants. this is actually the endpoint of our toxicological risk assessment. So if it occurs in plants, we have some measures of the amount of nickel that is being transported into biota. Okay, the aquatic risk module is on the next slide. Is based actually, well, skip the, well, okay. One more tab, Paul, on that one. Just take a look at pinapro.com and you can download this program, which is based on biotic ligand models. It's way too far to explain at the brief time we have available, but rest assured that the biotic ligand model is accepted by the European Committee as a risk assessment tool. And it is based on, again, free ion of nickel, and it is being directly coupled to aquatic species, 24 aquatic species in the environment. So this is how our risk module for the aquatic environment is designed. Okay, that was that. Then there's the third pillar. Am I still within my time? Well, I guess so. The third pillar I was promised to speak about is what we're doing also at this moment in the marine environment. This is a joint venture with Climate Cleanup, with Carbon Drawdown in Germany, and with Field Code in Poland. We're doing two types of experiments. First is the lab, in which we're trying to, well, at least come as close as natural conditions as we can. So we're performing these tests with 10 degrees and large amounts of olivine. And the main purpose of this phase is to identify the effect of physical abrasion. So as Lennart already pointed out, if you would like to apply olivine in the aquatic system or in oceans, you would like to know in what way the weathering rates are influenced by physical abrasion as compared to the chemical reactions that take place. So to quantify these and put these also in the model, this is the reason for those tests. And of course, to compare those with what happens in fresh surface waters. In the second part that will take place in, well, I think in a couple of months. Oh, one back. The second one is where we are actually trying to measure the amount of CO2 that is being sequestrated in a closed system. So the setup you see on the right-hand side at the lower graph, you can see that we have a closed system in which CO2 is measured directly in the atmosphere in the closed system. And we can calculate whether the CO2 which is being sequestrated coincides with our calculations, of course, of the olivine within this container. So that's part of the validations of our model. Okay, last slide is actually, well, more to say that all these research that we are doing, as well as the modeling, as the field plots, and the last one that I explained, it's also a team effort. Some of these people are present at the moment. Yeah, I see a few of them. And well, I will leave it with that. And well, if there are any questions, I will be happy to take them. Thank you.
All I want to do is give a brief overview of the work I've been involved with for enhanced weathering of mine tailings, which is what you'll see when we find the title screen is based on 3 projects, all with complementary aims and outcomes. The first is the G Group project, which I'm part of with the universities of Southampton and Oxford, which is coming to an end in the next 6 to 12 months. There it is. Then there's the SAP4CCS, I'll call it a mini project, I guess, working with Pretoria and Cape Town in South Africa. And then finally, the Details project, which has just received funding from the EU as part of Marie Curie. That's set to start in January 2022 with the Spanish National Research Council in Barcelona. I'd just like to quickly demonstrate why we and other labs such as Ian Power, who's going to talk soon, and his group are looking at mine tailings. So there's the first one. It's the point is that there's a lot of it for a start. Through our own estimates with GGRU, we think there could be as much as 17 gigatons produced annually. It might be higher than that, might be slightly lower, but that's growing anyway with demand and as metal resources continue to grow, plus we have historic tailings. The next one there is that the crushing and grinding that takes place for resource extraction produces these fine silt grains that, as we know, favorable increased fresh surface, reactive surface areas and increased weathering rates. Next one is that something that gets a little bit overlooked is how the mining industry, it has the equipment, the space, the expertise, and the ability to generate these wastes, move them around, store them on site, or put them somewhere through a continuous system, which will be required if we're going to utilize enhanced weathering and mineral carbonation on a global scale. The next one, going back a little bit to the first one as well, is that we have gigatons of material. A lot of that is generated from mafic and ultramafic rock, meaning there's a large pool of chemically favorable material to work with too for calcium and magnesium content. And we've also seen stepped up interest from major players in industry over the last 5 years or so, including some established projects from Anglo American and De Beers with academic partners. And there's more in the pipeline from the likes of Vale, Rio Tinto and BHP. And that's because it's in their best interest to be involved in such projects as they're getting their own house in order. There's as much as 5 gigatons emissions, scope 1 per year, might be more than that if you consider scope 2 and 3 emissions too. Next slide. So one of our first objectives with the GGRU project at Southampton was to classify which materials to target, how much material there is available in terms of the different commodities and host rock types, and how much CO2 can be theoretically be removed. To do this, we made sure that we covered all the main silicate hosted commodity types, such as gold, platinum, diamonds, copper, etc. You can see them listed there at the bottom. And we gathered information on their production tonnages from reports, the chemical compositions of the tailings from the literature, and some global locality examples too. We used, just go back one, sorry. We just used the chemical compositions to develop an enhanced weathering potential based on the whole rock geochemistry, and an enhanced weathering potential formula derived by Phil Renforth in his 2019 Nature Communications paper. Essentially, more magnesium and calcium is more favorable. Now you can go to the next, which is just a small graphical summary of the results. Thing to note here is that the more chemically favorable material goes up the y-axis, the more volumetrically abundant material goes across the x-axis, and the higher CO2 removal goes across and upwards. So just go to next, and I can talk about that in more detail. It's got the error bars and such associated with different production ranges and different geochemistry. If you just click once, you'll see that, as we would expect, high calcium, high magnesium, mafic and ultramafic hosted commodities, such as those that host diamonds, olivine, PGM, nickel, asbestos, show the highest chemical potential. But what's interesting, if you click once more, is that despite more modest chemical potential, you'll see that copper and titanium deposits, usually associated with mafic rocks, show high CO2 removal potential thanks to their massive global volumes, larger reservoir, and that warrants further attention. So just one more click on this slide. The overall global mineral mining industry has the potential to operate at net neutral or maybe even net negative emissions by the implementation of bicarbonate and carbonate removal schemes. Okay, next. So a few notable examples here taken from the USGS mine database. If you click once, please. The Diavik diamond mine, for example, the Mount Keith nickel mine, which has had a lot of work done on it. Some that are currently receiving such attention, such as the European olivine mines we've seen in the previous talk, the Norwegian ones and the Landoy mine in Spain. And also maybe a bit more ambitiously, the copper and titanium mines, such as El Teniente and the Telnes titanium mine. So there's a large cluster of suitable sites in South Africa. That's of particular importance as their government is now trying to look to ways to offset their substantial carbon outputs. So that's what we're looking at in the SAP4CCS project with Pretoria. We're building a GIS database for the national potential of South Africa. It's worth restating here that De Beers, as well as Anglo, big prominent players in South Africa, they're looking at possible implementation methods on their sites. So South Africa has the geology, the sites, and now the interest as well. So while the numbers for CO2 removal potential are both promising and positive, at this stage, it's nothing more than the overall maximum potential values, and they don't consider the issues we face kinetically to realise this potential. At present, most of the tailings of the minerals react too slowly to make a significant contribution despite their high potential, which means our impacts are limited to minerals such as brucite and, of course, olivine. The top graph there shows the cumulative CO2 removal by weathering under ambient conditions from some of our more typical mafic minerals. It shows that the fine grain minerals dissolve more quickly, increasing alkalinity, but really only olivine at grain sizes of 100 microns or less weather completely on a decadal timescale. The bottom graph shows a hypothetical mine waste made up of mafic minerals under ambient conditions. It's relatively slow alkalinity generation, mostly coming from olivine, but if we can increase the acidity, such as by using CO2 saturated water, we can increase the rates of dissolution. But there's work to be done to realise the full potential. Minerals such as plagioclase and pyroxene, which is what's preventing mines such as our copper and titanium mines from currently being suitable for any large-scale implementation. So that means that we have to fully investigate and characterise the true potential of different mine wastes, optimise the conditions for mineral dissolution and carbonation, and integrate all the variables and external considerations, but most importantly, implement methods to enhance weathering of minerals in a way that can be upscaled and implemented on mine sites. And that's what we're hoping to do in the upcoming Details project. So next, and I don't need to dwell on this because we know it all, but there are a number of possibilities for accelerating dissolution, such as microbial acceleration, increasing partial pressure of CO2 and temperature additions, all of which need to be further investigated and will be hopefully in our Details project. So the Details project is establishing industry partners to test the materials and look at implementation on pilot scales on site, both in Europe and worldwide. We're making progress with some of our partners, and we're hoping to have a good range of sites and materials to work with. So to summarize then, we've made a lot of progress, mainly through the G Group project, investigating the overall global potential of mine wastes, the potential of particular regions such as South Africa, and we want to go into more detail with that SAT4CCS project. And reactivity, we focused at the moment on platinum mine waste from the Mogalakwena platinum mine in South Africa as part of the G Group project. There's still work to do in these areas, and the next step is to focus our attention on certain mine sites, certain materials, and to work closer with industry. And the aim is to upscale our experiments to on-site pilot schemes next, and possibly work with other projects such as DAC projects and other similar CO2 removal schemes. So that's it for my very quickly rush through presentation on what we're doing. Hopefully it set the scene for some more detailed projects and talks which are going to come next. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks to the organizers for organizing the workshop and for inviting me. Thanks, Paul. I just want to give an overview of the research that my group is doing. I know many of you don't know me, so I thought I might introduce myself. My name is Ian Power. I'm a professor at Trent University in Ontario, Canada. I describe myself as an environmental geochemist and geomicrobiologist. My entire research career has been devoted to CO2 sequestration. I've published widely on a variety of topics, including natural analogs where CO2 is naturally sequestered in carbonate minerals. I've published on bioweathering and bioleaching, also the roles of microbes in mineral precipitation, enzyme-mediated carbonation. I've also looked at magnesium-based cements, studying passive carbonation at mine sites, looking at CO2 injection as well, and CO2 fluxes. The approach that I take with research, just to give you some background about my work, is mainly through experiments, both in the laboratory and the field, and field studies, again, at natural environments as well as mine sites. Myself and colleagues, we've published on a variety of different mine sites, including the Clinton Creek asbestos mine, the Diavik diamond mine, the Mount Keith nickel mine, and then much of my research now is focused on the diamond mines. As Liam mentioned, Yeah, the mining industry is going to play a huge role in enhanced rock weathering as a supplier of the types of material that we want to examine. And so again, most of my research has been focused at what's occurring within the mine sites. My research group is examining a variety of enhanced rock weathering projects and different materials, including wollastonite, olivine-rich samples, and serpentinites. But Paul had asked me to speak a bit about our research with De Beers. Several years ago, they launched a project called Project Carbon Vault with the goal of using their mine wastes, which are again are very magnesium-rich, sort of ultramafic, using those to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And so my group at Trent University, along with Sasha Wilson at the University of Alberta, Gord Southam at the University of Queensland, Greg Dibble at UBC, and Colette Southam at Bond University are the sort of the research arm of Carbon Vault. And each group is focused on different aspects of enhancing CO2 sequestration using these mine wastes. But my group is looking at more sort of natural weathering process or enhanced rock weathering. And we've kind of looked at this across the board. I like this diagram because it kind of gives the spectrum of weathering processes. We've studied yellow ground, which is natural kimberlite that's weathered over a long period of time. And there's a lot of things that we've learned from that in terms of how much kimberlite could weather over a long period of time. Of course, we're looking at weathering and CO2 sequestration within the active mine sites, but we've also, many of these have either closed impoundments or there's quite a number of closed mines, which again, you have these mine wastes that have been sitting weathering for, potentially decades or longer. Some of the mine wastes that we've studied date back to pre-1912. So again, there's a lot that we can learn from studying these environments and what sort of rates can we achieve through enhanced rock weathering. And of course, you could think about moving this material offsite, but I should say that De Beers has no intention of, at this point, of moving material offsite. And yeah, so my group is looking at a variety of mines in South Africa, including Voortspit and Venetia, as well as mines in Botswana, Orapa, and Jawang. And again, these are very large diamond mines. I just thought I would show you a few images from the sites. Venetia is South Africa's largest diamond mine. They produce about 4.7 million tons of mine waste per year. On the left here, you can see these are the fine residue impoundments. They take about an area of about 3.5 kilometers. And then towards the bottom of this image is the coarse residue impoundment. And if you take a moment and you sort of forget that these are mines, from our perspective, these are large scale enhanced rock weathering experiments. Essentially, of course, as Liam mentioned, the mining companies, they've taken this rock, crushed it and pulverized it, and then spread it out. And so, these are sort of experiments at a much larger scale than we can achieve in the laboratory, of course. I just wanted to give you, for those of you that maybe haven't visited a large mine, it really does give you the perspective of the scale at which you would have to mine rock, process it, and then sort of move it around. This is the fine residue deposits. So this is where material is dumped as a slurry. It's less than 1 millimeter. So there is a range in grain sizes, but it is fairly fine grain material. And then, as I mentioned, they also have a coarse residue stream. This is between 1 and 8 millimeters. So it's quite a bit coarser and therefore less reactive. In terms of our approach to CO2 mineralization at mine sites, really begins with mine waste characterization, which isn't the most exciting aspect, but it's incredibly important. We spend a lot of work characterizing our mine waste in terms of its mineralogy, its physical properties like particle size and surface area, as well as its geochemistry. I think it's important to, and Liam alluded to this, is that you have a wide variety of commodities. And even within a single mine, let's say Venetia, the rock there's a lot of heterogeneity to the rock. The mineralogy can vary within a single deposit, let alone different diamond mines or different commodities. And so there has to be a lot of work put into mine waste characterization. It's not going to be a single mineral. You have a very complex system. And then we also look at, again, what's passively happening. What's the passive rate of carbonation? If mining companies aren't going to get credit for CO2 credits, for example, they need to be doing something above what is already happening at the mine site. And then again, we also look at assessing the reactivity of these mine wastes. And then with all that information, it can speak to us about what is rate limiting, and that's sort of information that moves into thinking about how we can develop acceleration strategies for enhancing carbon sequestration at a mine site and developing our field trials. I'll just show a few projects from my group. Carlos Paulo is a postdoctoral fellow. He developed a leach test. We wanted to be fairly simple that a commercial laboratory could do. So it's a batch experiment. We wanted to be able to deal with mineralogically complex samples because, again, let's say for our kimberlites, you can have 10 plus minerals within your sample. And so, and in these leach tests, we're also distinguishing between magnesium and calcium that's leaching from our silicate minerals, which of course is desirable, but many of these rocks have accessory amounts of carbonate minerals. And it's important to distinguish between whether that calcium and magnesium is coming from a carbonate mineral or a silicate mineral. Carlos is also looking at geochemical modeling to determine the passive rates of carbonation at the mine sites. Again, if you think of these as enhanced rock weathering, large-scale demonstration projects, one thing that the mining companies do is, because of regulations, they have to do a lot of water sampling and analysis, and they have databases of their water chemistry that spans decades. And so Carlos has been modeling some of that water chemistry to understand what are the rates of CO2 sequestration at the mine scale using pre-existing data. Amanda Stubbs, who just finished her master's and moving on to her PhD, in her experimental studies, she looked at measuring the direct drawdown of CO2 into a variety of mine waste. So this graph here is pulverized kimberlite. That's the rock that they're mining at the diamond mines. And you can see these are negative fluxes. So she's directly measuring the drawdown of CO2 within these mine wastes. And then Duncan McDonald, who's just finished or just starting his master's, we're trying to work on developing field deployable column experiments that we could use at a demonstration project to track and determine the rates of CO2 sequestration through enhanced rock weathering. Again, he's looking at kimberlite, but also wollastonite, serpentinite, and olivine rocks. Just before the pandemic hit, we were fortunate to be able to set up 1 ton experiments in South Africa, and these have been running for over a year now. We're just finishing up this project, so I don't have too much data to show you right now. But these were 1 ton experiments to look at different management strategies for these mine wastes to see if we can accelerate CO2 sequestration and test different approaches to determining the rate of CO2 sequestration. This work right now is kind of laying the foundation for developing larger scale pilots that are currently being planned. We're hoping to move up to sort of 100 ton experiments in the near future. And I'll just put a finish out here. For these projects and other ones, I am recruiting graduate students. So if you know students that are interested in doing this kind of work, then please contact me. Or if you have questions about this research, please email me.
My name is Rhys Savage, and I'm a PhD researcher at Cardiff University School of Engineering. Within my PhD, I'm attempting to assess the applicability of selected test methods to assess both carbon capture and the potential implications of enhanced carbon mineralization on mine drainage geochemistry. So firstly, I think it's important to establish why my research project is relevant. It's been highlighted within the Greenhouse Gas Removal Report by the Royal Society that there is a need to establish international science-based standards for monitoring, reporting, and verifying greenhouse gas removal. It's been well established by various research groups that mine waste in the form of tailings and waste rock with suitable mineralogies could be used as a feasible feedstock for large-scale carbon sequestration with the aim of offsetting net mine emissions and potentially commodifying the wastes through carbon capture. The majority of work carried out in this research sphere is concentrated on tailings materials due to the smaller particle size distributions and subsequent higher absorption rates. A lot of research in this area has been concentrated on assessing the applicability of waste materials without assessing the secondary environmental implications of large-scale carbon capture projects within these type of mine projects, which often already have existing issues related to pH and elevated metal contents within the drainage water. So my research is placed uniquely in the carbon capture and mine drainage sphere. Not only does my research allow potential quantification of carbon capture suitability of mine wastes, but it also has the potential to improve standard methods of assessing mine waste weather under varied conditions. Within my PhD, I have and I will continue to develop enhanced methods to assess the potential implications of enhanced CO2 concentrations in mine waste materials. This is an important research theme as the push for greater carbon negative technologies sort of enhances, and the academic knowledge is there that suitable mine waste could be used as a suitable feedstock. And because of this, the environmental impacts of such schemes have to be assessed. To date, only limited studies have been carried out assessing the potential implications of these enhanced CO2 conditions on mine drainage quality. Static and kinetic testing on mine wastes when exposed to enhanced CO2 concentrations may allow development of engineered systems to enhance carbon capture and reduce acid mine drainage in some mine drainage systems. A dual approach of capturing carbon as well as reducing mine drainage quality issues provides an attractive prospect to mine companies, as it may reduce long-term costs and environmental impacts related to traditional mine closure planning. So this first schematic sort of underlies the traditional way of thinking around mine projects and how they're perceived. You have an asset in the form of a commodity. Ore from the commodity is processed and extracted. Waste is produced, which is ultimately becomes a long-term liability in whichever way that it happens with that selective project. I believe there's a slightly better way to perceive these types of projects. In the second schematic, through the use of passive or enhanced carbonation technologies, you can both reduce the potential environmental impacts of such projects through production of alkalinity in the drainage system, but also store stable carbon, which could potentially be traded. So you're creating an asset to asset cycle. I know in reality, in the industry, we're a long way off from viewing projects in this way, but I think it's something that needs to be worked on through academic industrial collaboration projects. Please don't view my positivity as naivety. I realize completely carbonating a whole waste rock dump is unlikely, but I think a reduction in liability is possible, and the possibility of creating an asset to the site is also a possibility. So my PhD, working with Geochemical Limited as my industrial partner, has given me the access to mine waste rock from 2 active Boliden AB mines in Scandinavia. Through collaboration with Boliden and their consultancy partner MEM, we've been able to secure waste rock from 2 commodities with differentiating mineralogies. Grasse, a nickel copper platinum group elements mine within northern regions of Finland, and Aitik, a copper gold silver mine within northern Sweden. These mines were chosen due to the access to the waste material as well as their differentiating mineralogies. Grasse is magnesium rich in the form of olivine, dioxide, tremolite, which is most of those minerals, all those minerals have been shown to be more suited to enhanced carbonation due to the quicker reaction kinetics of carbon dioxide. Aitik is less traditionally suited to carbon capture projects, having a large proportion of sulfide minerals with some calcium silicate proportions in the form of anorthite and albite. That waste also has a high proportion of pyrite than Kunditsa. So my simplified hypothesis for this research is that carbon dioxide, whether it be atmospheric or anthropogenically enhanced, has an impact on mine waste drainage quality and prediction. Silicate-rich mine waste has the potential to capture carbon through enhanced weathering, which could have potential offset of a proportion of mine's waste emissions, the mine's CO2 emissions. My core research aims within this project are set out in 4 main points, using industry standard kinetic tests such as a humidity cell to assess the impact of enhanced CO2 concentrations and altered temperatures have on leaching characteristics in these types of tests, investigate the potential changes in waste rock material characteristics after exposure to altered testing conditions compared to a standardized test, as well as assessing how the types of altered testing procedures could be used to model systems in which CO2 concentration are enhanced. So just to give a brief outline of my core PhD experiments, the experiments I've mentioned previously within my PhD research take the form of humidity cell tests. Within the site, you can see a schematic of humidity cell set as it's set up with 2 images of 2 cells in my current operational rig. The fundamental purpose of humidity cell is to obtain reaction rates of primary minerals in a sample from weekly flushing of waste samples within a constructed cell. The chemical makeup of leach water is analyzed weekly from each cell. This is carried out until leachate chemistry reaches steady state. This steady state can then be used for prediction of drainage chemistry and depletion times of various acid generating, neutralizing, alkaline generating, and metal leaching minerals. The key difference between my cells and the standard humidity cells, such as those using the ASTM method, is that I've introduced a 10% carbon dioxide gas mix within the cells. We've applied this a recommendation from an EPO method that suggested 10% CO2 in assessment of coal waste. We've applied this within an ASTM standard cell. This allows not only quantification of the impact of enhanced CO2 on mine waste weathering, but also the assessment of the applicability of alterations on the standard test, such as a humidity cell. My experiment's been running for 60 weeks within temperature controlled rooms and samples held either at 25 degrees or 10 degrees. The influence of temperature is particularly interesting due to the cold temperatures at the source mine locations. At this stage, I can't give any data as we've not published or submitted my thesis yet, but results have shown sort of general trends I can go through. Increases in pH of leachate recovered from cells with enhanced CO2 concentrations compared to control cells, large increases in dissolved inorganic carbon of both Kevitsa and ATIC. Cumulative DIC for Kevitsa has reached 400 milligrams per kilogram compared to 50 milligrams per kilogram in control cells. Leachate alkalinity has increased over the test period, as well as marked decreases in acidity. And there's been a clear suppression of sulfate, which has been marked in the CO2 cells. Other experiments have been assessed as part of this project include carbonation rate reaction vessels in the form of oxytop measuring heads. These heads are kind of in their preliminary stage at the moment, but the heads will measure internal pressure change in a closed system to allow assessment of materials' initial uptake of CO2. This test is still in its primary stage, as I mentioned, but we're seen as potentially a low-cost, rapid, simple method of assessing materials' potential to consume CO2. If anyone's interested, we had a little conference paper that we put out a couple of years ago at Mine Closure. Skip through that fairly quickly. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, let me know either now or after, and I'll be happy to answer.
My name is Grace Andrews, and I'm here representing Project Vesta. So Project Vesta, we are a US-based nonprofit, and our mission as an organization is really to bring together scientists from a wide range of backgrounds to strategically advance the science behind coastal enhanced weathering, or what we're calling coastal carbon capture, so that we can hopefully get to scale deployment a lot quicker. So we're doing this, we've got sort of a 3-phase approach. We're doing fundamental research in laboratories, modeling, experiments, things like that. We hope to soon move to pilot trials. And eventually, as I said, the goal is to get to large scale deployment all over the world. So for this talk, I'll just run through some of the studies that we have underway, some of our preliminary findings, and where we're hoping to go shortly. So one of our major areas of study is ecotoxicology. We have conducted acute toxicity tests on baby burrowing polychaetes in 100% olivine sand. So this is kind of an end member case. Not proposing to do 100% olivine sand, but just to see. And the results have been very encouraging. So what we're finding is that we have 100% survival of these polychaetes. And informally, we have found that they have comparable activity levels to polychaetes in our control siliclastic sand. So similar sediment tracks, burrow formation, et cetera. And where we're planning to go from here is chronic toxicity tests. So not just looking at survival, but both but that and growth and reproduction for increasingly complex organisms. So other invertebrates such as corals and oysters, fish, plants, seagrass, mangroves, and we'll also be monitoring for heavy metal accumulation along the way. Another area of our research is sediment transport. So as I'm sure you can intuit, in coastal enhanced weathering, it's essential that when we deploy olivine sand in the beach environment, that olivine sand stays in the active layer. Essentially, we don't want it burying and being removed from the weathering environment, but we also don't want it to be exported and dispersed such that we can't monitor it and actually quantify carbon capture. So here we have a model for vertical sorting of olivine in a coarse quartz sand. It's a little difficult to see, but what we have in this figure is we have 12 olivine sand grains, these are the black ones, mixed into, as I said, quartz sand. And what we've done is we have adjusted the grain size of the olivine to be smaller than the quartz sand, such that they have a similar or identical settling velocity. And then we run the simulation, and what we found is that by the 10th wave flow reversal, actually all of that olivine has been buried. So it happens very quickly. And so what we think is going on here is that in this case, the sand is sufficiently coarse that actually there's very little resuspension during the wave crest. So you can see in this figure, this is peak wave crest, and very, very few of the grains are actually being resuspended. What that tells us is that probably in this case, when you have quartz sand grains or just a low energy environment, the settling velocity is not a great indicator or a predictor of the appropriate grain size. So some of our future work will be to run similar simulations, but with smaller grain sizes or higher wave energies where we think settling velocity might be a better predictor of the appropriate grain size for olivine in a larger sediment. Yeah, okay. Something else we are thinking about and doing is some geochemical modeling. So here I'm showing you some of our results from a 1D top-down model of sediment, column, and pore water. So what we've done is we've run a simulation by applying a 2 centimeter thick layer of olivine on top of siliclastic beach sand. And in this model, solids and bottom waters can diffuse into and out of the sediment. The model also allows for bioturbation, so that's the irrigation part of this model. And the inputs and outputs of the model include both solid fluxes, so calcite formation, clay formation, but also bottom water and pore water chemistry parameters, so alkalinity, calcium, silica, things like that. And so what we're finding here is that after just a few weeks, we're finding measurable changes in carbonate parameters such as pH and alkalinity, as well as silicon content. And so that's very encouraging, again, with an eye towards the ultimate goal of being able to measure these parameters in the field. So in this case, up next is what we'd like to do is build a 2D model. So essentially stack these columns side by side and allow for horizontal transport between them. Okay. And then finally, the last major group of things we're doing right now is we're conducting studies in what we're calling the natural laboratories. So we've got a study going at Papakolea Beach in Hawaii. This is one of only a few green sand beaches in the world where the sediment is about 30% olivine, naturally occurring. And so we are doing work out there to quantify in situ olivine dissolution rates and carbon sequestration, as well as looking at the formation of secondary minerals in sediments, the fate of trace metals, things like nickel and chromium, again, in sediments, secondary minerals that is, as well as in pore waters and column waters, and the impact of this high olivine content on the local biology and ecology. So part of the experimental plan here is we're comparing Papacolleo Beach, which I said is about 30% with olivine, with nearby adjacent beaches, which have variable olivine contents. So sort of looking at it as a gradient to try and understand the impact of increasing olivine components. Okay, and in terms of the future, where we're planning to go, we are planning to conduct a small pilot study in the Caribbean, where the experimental design here is we've got two very small pocket bays adjacent to each other. One will serve as a control bay and one will be an experimental bay where we deploy olivine, and we'll be monitoring them for everything you can imagine. So installing benthic flux chambers, collecting sediment cores, extracting pore waters, water column samples, doing ecological surveys, and looking at the chemistry of marine species in the area as well. That's the plan. Right now, in our timeline, we're at the acquire permit stage. So actually just a couple of weeks ago, we got our permit to come through, which is awesome. But that's just the first step. So the next thing to do is to conduct the ecotox experiments on the laboratory ecotox experiments on the local marine organisms. So the ones that will be directly impacted should this trial go ahead, as well as do extensive baseline sampling of both bays to really characterize the geochemistry, geomorphology, biology, etc. So if all that goes well, and if it seems that this could be deployed safely, we're hoping to actually put all of it on the ground in about a year from now. And then the last thing that we're just spinning up right now is Project Vesta is launching a social science arm to our research. So we're planning to conduct research sort of on two scales. One focused on community engagement and social science and the local community surrounding pilot trials. We want to understand their perceptions, their concerns, as well as things like how this affects local economies. The other side of this is we want to do broad social license research. So we want to fill in some of the major gaps in social science research surrounding coastal enhanced weathering, particularly looking at public perceptions in developing countries, countries that are equatorial, where their coastlines are particularly threatened by rising sea levels. What we found is that this focus is also often not represented in the literature, so we'd like to help remedy that. And yeah, I'll just add that we're always looking to build new collaborations, so please get in touch if you're interested in working with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks Patricia and Paul for having me here, and I'm just telling in the next couple of minutes a bit about my project on ocean alkalinity enhancement, and I called it what did work and what didn't work so far. The latter happened more often than the former, as it is if you start some new projects, right? So my project is about olivine, but not only. It's basically has a lot of minerals included, all doing similar or actually different things, and I'm working more on the pelagic carbon pump, if you want to say it like this, though in coastal settings mostly. So this is, of course, a composition of the solubility pump, but also of the biological carbon pump. And I'm very interested in the biological part of it. It's quantitatively not as important as the solubility pump, but it has the potential, to remove CO2 a bit on a longer time scale, as it can export it to the deeper sea. Hopefully, if it works. And my vision was to test if ocean alkalinity enhancement in forms of different mineral additions is able to basically synergistically optimize both carbon pumps in some way so that we do not lose biodiversity, that we actually facilitate it, and that we especially do not produce other greenhouse gases along the way, because this could easily happen if we promote primary production, right? So we didn't want to enhance nitrous oxide or methane emissions by performing mineral additions. So yeah, that was what we started with in some sort of naive manner. And we were aware that some suitable minerals were identified, and it was quite clear how much CO2 they theoretically were able to remove from the atmosphere per ton. And that sounded all kind of good. So I thought I'd do this threefold approach and just develop some sort of handling protocol on how to dissolve it in seawater, test it on some primary producers as I know it, and on some of the nitrous oxide producers and methane producers, take it to the field, check if the biodiversity is all responding the right way, and then look at the global ocean biodiversity and see where we can apply it without any danger. So that's so far. And yeah, problem was, of course, there were no informations about the dissolution kinetics in seawaters, especially not in different types of seawaters, which respond differently, as we figured out. And there was nothing really on the biology and on the biodiversity impacts of those mineral additions, and also not on nitrous oxide and methane production. So we had quite a handful to do, and we're of course not there. But so we started from there with the first challenge on how to dissolve that in seawater. And that was not especially easy, and I know this is a struggle for a lot of ocean scientists trying to do that, because it doesn't dissolve. Olivine doesn't want to dissolve in seawater, really. We did a typical marine geosystems geoscience approach and grinded it to a particle size of 63 micrometers, which is some sort of threshold where you expect seawater dissolution to be efficient. And it does dissolve, but the result was quite sobering. So that's something that didn't work ideally, but it kind of worked. Well, that's how it looks then. Because we get in artificial seawater, what you see here on the left, dissolution percentages or efficiencies of 30 to 60% at a max. In North Sea water, similar range, right? It didn't look ideal, didn't look too bad, but we came back to the 63 micrometers because it's easy to get, and if we are on a ship, cannot work with especially complicated methods. We cannot do big pre-dissolution approaches or similar. We need something that's easy to handle and can just be added to the surface waters. So we stick with it anyway, despite it was kind of sobering because it reduces the amount of CO2 per ton mineral added, of course, significantly, especially for Olivine. Well, so we continued, checked for pH, total alkalinity, DIC, stabilization, and positive effects. And I'm just showing you some series of experiments that we did. And this is only the pH value where we tried to figure out how much really to add that we do not kill organisms by overshooting the pH or similar things. And I just zoom into one of those graphs so that you can actually see something, and you can see we get a pretty high overshooting in pH from Olivine in surface seawater. Here you have the North Sea seawater. Dolomite does it a bit more gently, but also increases nicely and stabilizes over a runtime of more than 3 months. The other minerals were what we call the losers in the experiment. So we stick with Olivine and dolomite mostly because the other ones precipitated carbonates from the surface seawater that didn't look good, that actually caused an opposite effect. So yeah, this overshooting in pH caused though another problem. We put it into some of our nitrous oxide experiments on alkalinity manipulations and try to see how nitrous oxide, which is one of the strongest greenhouse gases, responds to it. And that didn't look very good because if you go over a pH of basically the normal seawater, surface water pH around 8.1, you get an increased nitrous oxide production, which is quite massive. That's not good. That's actually very problematic, as nitrous oxide is 300 times as strong of a greenhouse gas as CO2. So we will have to look more into this side effect and in which ecosystem this is relevant for. So back to the minerals. We also, of course, looked at the trace metal composition of our specific stones that we were using, and it has been put forward a couple of times that especially nickel is a problem. And of course, we found it also to be 3 orders of magnitudes higher than it is in dolomite. That's why we also stick to the comparison of those minerals, right? To just see if dolomite can't do the same job a bit more gently in a way. So Lennart summarized this effect of nickel on marine organisms in his paper from 2019 in Francis, which I think is a really nice compilation of data, where he shows that there's no way that you benefit all the organisms, and actually nickel, of course, is harmful, but it's different for all kinds of organisms. So we do just need a really deep understanding of each ecosystem before we add any trace metal, any mineral to it. And this essentially calls for two things. We need to understand how individual organisms respond, but we also need to understand which organisms we have in which ecosystem. So that's a tricky one. And we try to approach both of it. The first one we did, of course, with culture studies. We tested especially primary producers, cyanobacteria, but also nitrous oxide producers, and now also methanogenic organisms in the next step. And what we could figure out so far, and I just show you two short examples, is first the example of Micromonas. It's quite cosmopolitan algae. Very important primary producer. It's a green algae in the ocean, and it looks like this if you grow it with minerals. And if we look at how it grows, if we add different minerals, it's doing actually just fine. So that's actually what worked well. This organism doesn't feel disturbed by anything. It actually seems to slightly benefit from olivine. So this would be an organism that responds very well and which wouldn't face any damage, but rather benefit from olivine additions, which is kind of nice. So there's another organism, and I hope my PhD student's not watching me because I did this experiment myself. So it's probably flawed with my culture of nitrogen fixing cyanobacteria, cyanotique, and I added the same minerals. But here everything died, just not the control. And so this would be an example of those minerals actually killing off some organisms in an ecosystem. And cyanotique is especially important, not only because it's a carbon fixer, a primary producer, it's also a nitrogen fixer. So it's a corner point of ecosystems. So again, we would need to know if this is an organism present in an ecosystem before we add such minerals, because we can't lose it. All right, so we are on the way to test around 35 more individual cultures and do also some competition experiments between different groups. Kind of important to understand if we change functions in ecosystems. And then we take this to the next step and we'll try it out in Limfjorden. That's a Danish fjord. That's Denmark, by the way, because I am from Denmark here. And we will try it out in the southern part of Limfjorden, where we study the microbial community and phyto community already, and there's a long-term monitoring of different biogeochemical parameters available, making our life easier there. So what we are doing there is essentially really monitoring the biodiversity in response to those mineral additions in terms of metagenomics. So we will just sequence the whole community before, during, and after the experiments, after the additions, to see if we introduce biodiversity shifts. I find this extremely important. And we will also see if we get a shift in functional groups, because just because an organism is there and is abundant doesn't mean it does a lot in terms of rates. So we will also have this information on who are the key carbon fixers, the key nitrogen fixers, and the key greenhouse gas producers actually in response to mineral additions. I find this really important and exciting too. And then in the last bit, we will map the ocean for its metagenomic potential, meaning that we actually look into what kind of organisms we have in the different parts of the oceans using all kinds of available metagenomes. We're trying to also close the gaps on a map that we have already here to see then if we have sensitive organisms in an environment, or if we have organisms that would benefit from mineral additions, to then basically answer where can organisms handle mineral additions, including olivine or dolomite, and where it would not be a good idea to add that. And this is basically where we are right now. And I want to just say this is those are the funding agencies funding this project and my way to research. And if I say we, I usually mean Jakob, my PhD student on the project, as well as my technicians Eric and Sara, as well as the rest of my group, who's of course great, and my internal and external collaborators, and especially the colleagues. Some of you are in the audience, and that's just a selection of you who always are so kind to share data and knowledge and everything else. I find this really amazing in this kind of community. And that's about it.
I'd like to give a quick overview of the research that is ongoing in my research group here at University of Antwerp. We have research ongoing on marine enhanced silicate weathering as well as terrestrial enhanced silicate weathering, but there will be a presentation later by Sara about this. This has been a disturbing graph to me, and it's still a disturbing graph. It's what we need to do to reach the Paris targets in terms of carbon removal, in terms of negative emissions. And it says that we need to reach the giga scale. So a gigaton of CO2 is a lot. And when I see those presentations where there's the gigaton symbol appearing, the question is how to reach this, because it's really a lot of CO2. But not only we need to reach the gigaton scale, we need to reach it tomorrow. And that means within the next 2 decades. And that implies that we cannot use new technology, because we cannot afford to build new machines or to investigate new processes, put pilot plants first and then ask for permissions to build big plants and ask for money to build those big plants, because normally that takes at least a number of decades. So we need to do it with existing technology if you want to achieve it. And so we have to look for an existing reactor that is able of CO2 drawdown at this gigaton scale. And my best guess for such a reactor is the coastal zone, which is an existing large weathering reactor. It runs on sustainable energy, and by that means that there is energy available in terms of waves and currents and bioturbation that is capable of helping us with the acceleration of the weathering in terms of removing crusts and removing weathering crust, etc., and keeping and grinding and milling the particles by natural forces. So we've been looking at enhanced silicate weathering in coastal environments. We've put in a proposal, and this was a proposal which was in competition with other proposals, with pharma proposals and with medicine proposals. And so we had to come up with a business plan. And we identified the mining, the distribution, the monitoring, the CO2 monitoring, and the trading as the 4 components of the business plan. And we estimated the cost of large volume olivine applications between 30 and 50 euros per ton of CO2, because in a coastal zone we can use large grain sizes, so we don't need to grind to a small size, which costs a lot of energy, and we don't need road transport on land, which avoids a lot of costs. So that's why it's a cost effective compared to other negative emissions, and so you can make actually a business plan for this. So there is you can make a convincing business plan for this. You don't need any subsidies. It can be business as usual. There is an economic incentive for doing this, given the fact that also the CO2 price and the CO2 credit price is rising. The disadvantage is obviously when there's such an opportunity, there's the potential for cowboy entrepreneurs that just do it without properly investigating whether it works and whether it is safe. So if you look at technology readiness level, we do have like mineral production, we do have coastal distribution technology that is available. Carbon credit trading is developing. So what we need to do is to monitor whether there's CO2 sequestration and whether there's an environmental impact. So technology, this idea is ready. So yes, there is an industry, the mining and marine engineering industry is basically ready to roll. But it's basically a societal question. Should we do it? And therefore we need to answer these research questions. One is, does it work? And what is the CO2 sequestration efficiency? And then obviously, is it safe? What are the environmental consequences of doing this? So we're running this project now, which started in 2018 and continues until for 5 years. And our research questions is here. We think of 2 ways. One is further offshore shelf applications, where we use the dynamics of the waves and the currents to basically help grinding and polishing the olivine grains. And then we have beach applications where we focus on biota and where the olivine is mixed in the sediment. And obviously there's an alkalinity release, and alkalinity release then causes CO2 sequestration. And the questions are, what is physical stimulation by these waves and currents? How does this help this alkalinity release? And is there an effect of biota, microbiology, both microbiology and larger fauna on the release of alkalinity? And obviously when you weather olivine, when you dissolve olivine in the sediment, that doesn't mean that the alkalinity necessarily comes out. You need the alkalinity to escape from the sediment, and that is when the CO2 sequestration will happen. And then obviously, what is the impact on coastal ecosystems of all this? So we had to make a plan, a business plan, which involves basic research and lab demonstrations, and that's the phase where we are now. Then we move on to a field trial where and then we have to find a niche market where we can develop the technology to move up to a broader market, and we can think of bigger volumes. So right now we're here and we're doing flume experiments to test the mechanical and stimulation of the weathering in coastal environments. We have these mesocoms running where we do the biologically stimulated enhanced weathering. And we'd like to go to these natural sites, but because of COVID, we haven't reached them. And I just learned that other people are doing field research there. So for the mesocosms, we have invested quite substantially in this CO2 drawdown facility, where we have these mesocosms, where we simulate 1 square meter of coastal seafloor, and we want to exactly know what fluxes are coming out of the sediment and how these fluxes change when you add, for example, olivine to these things. And so the most important is obviously the alkalinity release, but we're all looking at the rest of the geochemistry, and we are looking at the how the biota react to this. So we have a closed system, which means that there's an overlying water here, which is recirculated, and this way we have a full control, a full mass budget for these mesocosm systems. They are equipped with automatic water quality, pH, temperature, etc. And this is now we have these mesocoms. Some of them are operational. 6 are operational since 6 years. So we can study the long-term evolution of enhanced weathering, and we have implemented 14 new ones this year and last year. And we are investigating different silicate types. We first focus on olivine, but we also like to use other mineral types. I'm very interested in receiving kimberlite, so I'm looking for ways to actually get kimberlite and buy or have kimberlite. So please contact me if you have a source of kimberlite or similar that we can use in these mesocosms. There's different grain sizes, different application loads, and we're investigating geochemistry, toxicology, and the ecology of these mesocosms. So we have ones with fauna and without fauna, and the fauna that we use is these lugworms. So we have ones with densities, natural densities of lugworms, bioturbated, and then without any bioturbation, and both with olivine and without olivine. And so what our key measure for the success of enhanced weathering for the CO2 drawdown is the alkalinity release from the sediment. So we have the control baseline alkalinity efflux from the sediment, and then when we add olivine, we expect that there is an additional alkalinity flux, and this is the one that's the CO2 additional CO2 that will cause additional CO2 sequestration due to enhanced silicate weathering. So what are the results? So we're now 2 years in the progress, and well, does it work? Yes, it does work. So our preliminary research findings indicate that the release rates that we have in these mesocosms with 100 micron grain size olivine. They are close to what you would expect from these laboratory beaker under idealized conditions experiments. And so this is the hangs and spires curve. This is all the lab experiments are summarized, and here we are in red dot. This is actually the rate that we have in our mesocosms. And we do see that this contains, so we have data from 5 years ago and we have data from last year. We see that this is sustained over all those years. And we see that it's important to keep the ecosystem functioning intact. So, so the natural mixing and the irrigation of the fauna, they clearly stimulate are key to these high rates of enhanced silicate weathering and these high rates of alkalinity release. Then is it safe? Well, this is it's a more elaborate question, but here, well, what we do see is that this is from last year where we tracked the olivine, well, we tracked the worm activity in those in the olivine tanks and the control tanks, and we don't see any difference in the population dynamics of the lugworms. So so this obviously we're doing also more detailed ecotox studies and on especially the nickel because of the high nickel content. This is the key concern when using olivine in enhanced weathering. And so this sensitivity issue to nickel remains an outstanding issue. And there's actually two types of sensitivity. There's the sensitivity to nickel of the marine organisms, but there's also the sensitivity to the nickel of the regulators and the government officials, and that's not necessarily the same. But we need to see whether they align and to what extent these are an obstruction to deploy the technique. So the next step is we are now trying or planning or talking about a field trial, which would be in the coastal zone of Belgium, where we think of an area of 1 by 1 kilometer. And this is a deteriorated site because it's a dump site for harbor sludge deposit. But we are now investigating the permission trajectory, and obviously this is a multiple stakeholder development. And this is what we are now doing. So to conclude, this is an overview of our research. There are 2 postdoc positions available in geochemistry and geomicrobial studies of these mesocosms and also the field sampling. And we have this project website where you find details about the project. Thank you very much for listening.
So thanks for organizing this. I will start right away. Project Cardiff, multi-scale research of terrestrial enhanced weathering across Europe. Now, my name is Jelle Bijma. I'm affiliated with the Alfred Wegener Institute in Bremerhaven, but I'm presenting this in the name of Ingrid Smet from Field Code in Greece, Mathilde Hagens, University of Wageningen in the Netherlands, Jens Hartman, University of Hamburg in Germany, and Dirk Peesler and Ralf Steffens, both from the Carbon Drawdown Initiative. Now, Drawdown is a project that is financed and part of the Carbon Drawdown Initiative. We started in October 2020, and the costs are covered by the 2 companies of Dirk and Ralf. We do expect the first results in this fall, but I should say that we have already reached a milestone because the people that I just named, they have grown together as a team, and we have been doing a lot and achieved a lot, even though we were hindered sometimes by COVID. Now, it was already said by Bullock that it's time to act now And just now, Filip Meysman also said that we need to use the existing infrastructure. So quantifying the weathering rate of rock mineral and apply that in agriculture is exactly what we want to do, and we want to turn this into a business model for the farmers, because only then they will automatically do it and using an existing infrastructure. So on another slide that Filip showed, which was nice, is a slide on the technology readiness level, and he said that, you know, first of all, we need to monitor the sequestration. That's exactly what we want to do. And we need to look at the environmental impacts. That is the other thing we want to do. So assess the risk of heavy metal contamination, specifically nickel, but also chromium. Now, the secondary goals are, of course, to investigate weathering not just in the field, but use different amendments and different crops, and look at this in different soils and different climate conditions. So we're using a whole suite of olivines, specifically in Greece. That is 2 different olivines from the Greek mines, then in Spanish and Italian, and an olivine from Norway, and the basalt from the Eifel, so-called Eifel gold. Also using different crops. We have grassland. We have our treatment plots also seeded with wild bee flowers. And then we're using 2 commercial crops, corn and cotton. Field experiments take place in Larissa in Greece, in Bramstedt, Germany, Fürth in Germany, and in Wageningen, the Netherlands. Now, in all cases, we look at the soil parameters in the beginning and at the end of the field experiment. That is pH, percentage carbon and nitrogen. We investigate the elemental composition, soil organic carbon, total organic carbon, cation exchange capacity, grain size, so percentage sand, silt, and clay, and the available surface area. Follow the weathering. We have a couple of systems that we analyze in the pool water. That is, first of all, the carbon chemistry, DIC, alkalinity, and pH. The cations, nickel, chromium, but also magnesium, silica, iron, calcium, and potassium. I think I forgot sodium in here, but there's also sodium in there. So we also analyze nutrients, not in all the plots, but in one of the plots, specifically in Bramstedt, we will do all of this. We look at the nutrients, sulfate, nitrate, nitrite, ammonia, and phosphate, and we look at stable isotope systems to have another constraint on the weathering rates. That will be lithium, rubidium, strontium, and possibly also beryllium. That is still under consideration. The other thing that we want to do is, in order to make this practical, you cannot ask the farmers in the future to measure all of these parameters. So we are looking for some proxies that give us an indication for the carbon that has been sequestered, and for that electronic sensors. Have a better feel for what is happening in the field. We have 2 other projects that are tagged onto this. That is the pot or greenhouse experiments carried out in Wageningen, and the weathering box that has been set up by Jens Hartman in Hamburg. And there we look at enhanced weathering under controlled conditions. We apply different amendments and can vary the hydrological and the PCO2 conditions. The greenhouse and pot experiments in Wageningen is similar, so we can have much more control over the impact of the crop on the weathering by combining the experimental setups of the 3 field sites. In a single greenhouse experiment. So those are all the goals. The last one that I should mention is that we try to improve the soil quality and look at the crop yield using biochar in order to tackle the problems of heavy metals, but also see if we have an increase in the yield similar to the terra preta. And I'll leave it here because I think we are pressed by time, and if there are questions, I will gladly answer that, or at the end of this this session.
I'm Ruben. I work indeed at the Federal Institute of Material Research in Berlin, and my research is more about how fungi enhance, or dissolve olivine. So it's more fundamental research. And for this purpose, we study the rock-inhabiting fungus Knuphia petricula. These fungi are black fungi. Black fungi are subaerially growing fungi, which grow on a whole range of substrates like monuments and solar panels. And because they degrade these monuments and they drop the yield of these solar panels, they're actually of interest to a research institute like the BAM in Berlin. These fungi are also dominant under harsher conditions because they're able to withstand a whole range of stresses. And we have selected one of them to model for them, which is Knuphia petricula, a fungus isolated from a marble monument in the 90s. And we study these fungi using genetic engineering techniques, for instance, CRISPR-Cas. So what we do is we delete certain genes of this fungus, thereby creating mutants. And these mutants, we do not have the gene, we compare to a wild type which do have a gene. And we compare them in different experiments. And by doing so, we can find out what the role is of a specific gene product, of the gene in a certain process. For instance, one gene that we knocked out first in our fungus was PKS, which is a gene involved in the synthesis of the black pigment melanin. And so as you can see right here on the right, this mutant is no longer black because it can no longer produce this black pigment. But I'm personally involved in the bioweathering studies of this fungus. So therefore I needed a simple, well-studied and easily weatherable mineral, which was olivine. So again, the first idea was not enhanced weathering. It was rather fundamental research on how this fungus dissolves minerals. So I use dissolution studies for which I grind this mineral, and this mineral together with my fungus, the wild type or a mutant, I incubate in my reactor systems, and that is run for a couple of months, which gives me, then I take samples, medium samples, and these medium samples gives me dissolution rates. So how fast does the olivine dissolve? I'm also running my experiments at 2 pHs, 4 and 6. The reason for that I'll come to later. This graph shows you dissolution rates of my abiotic batch and mix and flow experiments, of my experiments with the wild type and with the mutant. And these show two interesting things. The first one, abiotically at pH 6, our dissolution rate is over 2 orders of magnitude lower than the literature rates. And we believe that this is because our system allows iron to oxidize. And we know from the literature that oxidized iron or iron oxidizing at the surface of olivine inhibits olivine dissolution. We do not see this lower dissolution rates at pH 4 because at pH 4, the oxidation rate of iron is 3 orders of magnitude lower than at pH 6. So this whole inhibitory effect of iron does not play at lower acidic pHs. The second thing we see is that when a fungus or rock-inhabiting fungus attaches to the olivine, it is actually able to prevent the inhibition of olivine dissolution. So the dissolution rates are again much higher, 2 orders of magnitude higher. We believe that it does this through interaction with iron. We do not, however, have an idea how this is happening. This might be through direct iron uptake into the cell. The iron might absorb to the cell wall. The fungus might be able to solubilize the iron through production of iron chelators like siderophores. We have no idea how it is actually interacting with this iron to enhance the solution of olivine. But to find that out, we started creating a whole new range of iron uptake mutants. To describe this shortly, fungi mostly produce these iron chelators, siderophores, using a certain class of enzymes. For Knuphia, this is CYP-C. They produce these siderophores, which are released in a medium. In a medium, they will bind iron, and they will bring this ferric iron to ferric reductases, which are other enzymes, which reduce the iron. And then this reduced iron can be taken up through an oxidase permease system. And all these enzymes, all their genes are controlled by iron transcription factors. I will not talk about that so much, but we have created mutants. So we have knocked out the genes which encode these enzymes. And then you'll guess it, we have compared these mutants, their behavior, their olivine dissolution behavior to the wild type, to figure out which of these mechanisms is responsible for the higher olivine dissolution rate of the fungus. However, until now, we have not found one gene which is able to do this, because all our mutants behave very similar to the wild type. So that's quite disappointing until now. We have some more mutants that we want to test. Another idea might be that it's actually the iron is absorbing to the fungal cell wall, which will be hard for a bit of methods to test, because that's it's quite hard to find one gene which sort of controls, let's say, iron absorption to the cell wall. What is interesting though with these data as well is that this time we have done as well biotic experiments at pH 4, and they show that there is no biotic or fungal effect at pH 4, which again, remembering this iron hypothesis makes sense, because at this pH, iron oxidation is much lower. So the fungus interacting with iron will have no effect on the rate. And then just to end, we're also doing some interface experiments where we look at the fungus olivine interface using transmission electron microscopy. And there we have observed that at abiotic cases, there we observed an amorphous layer which was enriched in iron. And in the biotic case, underneath the fungus, we did not observe this layer, but we did observe enhanced weathering. So these data sort of agree with the dissolution data we have seen till now. I would like to thank my colleagues and BAM at GET, Jacques and GFZ. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Sara Vicca from the University of Antwerp, and I'll present some of the enhanced weathering work that we started quite recently. So we're doing some enhanced weathering experiments in pots with crops at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. We focus on experiments in agricultural settings to get a better idea of the carbon sequestration of enhanced weathering in real soils, and also to quantify the effect of enhanced weathering on plants and soil. And we work with different crops. We've worked with potatoes, wheat, and beans so far. At the moment, we work mostly in pots, because these pots allow us to quantify the leachate losses, and we need that to have an accurate estimate of the carbon sequestration rates. We have been doing experiments with different soils, on an alkaline soil and on acid soils. And we've been using basalt from the Eifel region. We didn't use olivine to avoid the nickel problem, actually. And we've also done some experiments combining basalt application with biochar application. The main aim of our experiments is to quantify carbon sequestration, and to do that, we sample the leachates. at the bottom of the pots. We analyze them for alkalinity or dissolved inorganic carbon. And after the experiment ends, we also sample soil to quantify soil carbonate formation, and we use that to estimate carbon sequestration rates. We also analyze the leachates and the soil and the pore water of the soil for different elements that are released during the weathering, including magnesium, calcium, iron, and also nickel. We measure soil CO2 and N2O emissions, and in future also methane, to estimate the total or the effect on the total greenhouse gas emissions. We also look into nitrification and denitrification and microbial processes that contribute to these. And of course, we look into how the plants react. We quantify plant growth and crop yield, and we do elemental analyses on the plants to see how they respond in terms of stoichiometry. A first experiment that we did was an experiment with potatoes. We set up a multifactorial experiment with basalt and biochar, and these were mixed into the top 20 centimeters of the soil. We also added fertilizers to all pots. The soil that we used was quite alkaline. It wasn't our primary intention, but we ended up with a soil with a pH of around 7.5. And as you can see, we also covered the pots and then we irrigated the plants regularly and sampled and analyzed the water inputs and outputs. So some first results, first on the carbon sequestration, you see here the results for the alkalinity in the leachates and in the rhizomes. So that's the pore water in the topsoil, where there is a clear effect visible of the basalt addition. So there was definitely some weathering going on. When we analyzed the soil afterwards, there was only a slight increase in the total inorganic carbon content of the soil, and it was not statistically significant. We then used the Freak-C model to estimate the carbon sequestration rates, and our preliminary estimate is 0.68 tons of CO2 per hectare per year, which is at the lower end of the range that has been reported in other experiments. And we also looked at the plant responses, more specifically at the potato biomass, where, well, we now have the biochar and the basalt effect shown. So there was a tendency for a positive effect of basalt addition on the potato biomass. That is the black dots show that. And then the blue dots show the biochar effect, which didn't have a significant effect on the potato biomass. The basalt effect was actually not significant either. But there seems to be emerging an interaction effect between the biochar and the potatoes, but none of these effects were statistically significant. We also analyzed the plant elements and found, again, an indication for an interaction effect between the basalt and the biochar, especially for calcium and magnesium, where without biochar, basalt addition seems to positively affect the calcium and the magnesium and also the phosphorus concentrations in the potatoes, while with biochar this effect decreases. But again, these effects are not statistically significant, although the interaction effect comes close to statistical significance. Maybe also interesting to mention is that these patterns were not visible in the rhizome data, so in the soil pore water data, we did not see any indication of such interaction effects. So there seemed to be some interesting plant-soil interactions going on here, but we have to dig deeper into that. And then we also analyzed nickel, where nickel concentrations in the potatoes, where we didn't see any effect of basalt addition, and we found a slight decrease due to biochar addition. And then a second experiment was with winter wheat. Here we had the alkaline soil that we used in the potato experiment and also an acid soil or more acid soil with a pH of 5. So we compared the two soils and we added basalt to both soils, and the alkaline soil was also treated with biochar. The results that we have for this are still preliminary. Sorry? Okay, so we didn't find significant basalt or biochar effects, although there was a tendency for a positive basalt effect on the above ground biomass and on the grains in the acid soil, but not in the alkaline soil, where there was a tendency for a decrease with basalt addition. But these are, the first results, so we still need to do further analyses on the other things that we measured. So now we're planning more experiments, also in pots at first. So the first thing we're planning is an experiment where we combine basalt addition, steel slag addition, and concrete fines in different amounts. So we are planning a gradient approach there. We also want to explore the role of soil biota in that experiment, and especially the role of mycorrhizal fungi that we think might have an effect on the weathering that might speed up the weathering. Maybe that's also a bit related to what Ruben just presented before. And then after, or in a couple of years, or in a year or so, we hope to do some field experiments. We're actually planning some in a new project that was funded in urban setting, and probably also in acidified forests. And then depending on what funding comes out, we will also do some experiments in agricultural fields. So that's it for my talk. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for sharing those. I don't have a formal PowerPoint type application prepared. My name is Ryan Brophy. I'm a field agronomist, crop advisor by trade. My specialty is the development of compound starter fertilizers. We focus predominantly on specific crop nutrient requirements, seed safe starters, and these types of practices. Over the past several years, with a lot of the customers and companies we work with, regenerative agriculture has, of course, been a massive topic of discussion. And I've had the privilege of working with many farmers across Canada and in the UK on that front. And then it was about a couple of years ago, a colleague of mine, a Glasgow-based colleague, introduced me to the principle of enhanced rock weathering. So not too long ago, and to me, this fell in perfectly with this regenerative ag initiative, and with the growers that are looking to, adopt new practices and new technologies for soil health specifically, but also their ROI. And so to me, having spent several months reading a lot of the documents, studies, and publications on the principles of enhanced rock weathering, the different products, I was sold 100%. And what I really enjoy about some of the products, and in our case, Metabasalt, is the material's capacity for soil remineralization, and such that we can address some of the agronomic issues that the grower is facing. And if we're able to achieve a certain amount of uptake at the grower level with these benefits, on the soil fertility front, on the product's capacity for soil buffering, and even pH adjustments in Eastern Canada when implemented. So it was basically uptake, and much like we're facing now with vaccine rollouts and adoption and all the mechanics of getting a proven technology where it needs to be in order to accomplish the task we hope it will. Our biggest hurdle has always been that of logistics. If it was sourcing ingredients for our fertilizer production or other, So we opted to try this out. It's one thing to approach the farmer with an option. It's another to be able to cost effectively provide this solution and this option to the grower. So we opted with our colleagues in the UK and the US to conduct some trials so far, as we started with truck delivery, small scale deployment in the spring of 2019. We ramped things up significantly for fall of 2020 and started bringing in our first rail cars. And there were a lot of struggles with regards to discharge and transport, but we were very excited to have 12 very eager and involved growers across Canada step up and apply metabasalt at various rates to their farmland for us to study. So we took essentially benchmark samples across all of them, and our hopes are, as we focus on the agronomic component, that academia and all of the experts in this field are able to assist with the development of a metric by which we'll be able to add the incredibly beneficial bonus of carbon capture mechanism to this, whilst we also look at the giant benefits of nitrous oxide emission reductions when applied with conventional agricultural fertilizers. So having proven our mechanism by receiving product by rail, discharging with a tracked excavator into a truck, and our intent this year is to, beginning in June, receive, transload, stockpile, and deploy 25,000 metric tons in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, southeastern Alberta, as well as some tonnage into Ontario, and hopefully, as the information and the adoption continues to pick up, we're looking to access directly 30 to 40,000 hectares of productive farmland this year, and continue that monitoring. Continue to look at the benefits of incorporating other products such as compost, elemental sulfur, for some acidulating effect in the higher pH soils of the prairies, as well as biochar and some other bacterial substrates. So we're pretty excited to be working with a great team of researchers. I've spoken with many of you on several occasions, and it's gonna be a big year for sure. And yeah, we're just really excited about what the future holds. And that's our upcoming year, kind of in brief. And we're going to build a big green mountain and try to get it out to as many farmers as we can. And yeah, thank you very much.
So hello everyone. So I've been enjoying the workshop so far. A lot of different ideas coming together. So that's obviously very good for getting our story as good as possible when we go to people in farms and government and so on to tell our story. So today I'll be focusing on inorganic carbon accumulation in agricultural soils. And I'll basically be telling you the story of what happened over the last few years here in Guelph as we moved from lab scale experiments to field scale experiments. So Emily Chung is my colleague. She's an associate professor at the University of Guelph. I am an assistant professor at the University of Guelph, and we're both in the environmental engineering program. So essentially what we've been working on is the application of wollastonite in agricultural soils. So I'll give you a little bit of a background of why we are doing this. So first of all, we're working with wollastonite because we have a mine here in Ontario, which is one of the few mines that commercially produce wollastonite. And I believe they're the only one in Canada, and maybe the only one, or maybe there's another one in the US. But so it's very rare to find a commercially operating wollastonite mine near farms. So given that we have this opportunity here, we decided to work with wollastonite. The second benefit of working with wollastonite is that being a calcium silicate, it tends to weather faster than other silicates. So for example, basalt and olivine and so on, they tend to weather more slowly. So weathering faster helps us to see effects more quickly. And then the third thing that is nice about wollastonite is that being a calcium silicate means that we go looking for calcium carbonates in the soil. And it's always, I find it a little bit easier to go find calcium carbonates than it is to find magnesium carbonates. And in part because it's more likely that calcium carbonates will actually precipitate and accumulate in the soil. So that's a little bit of the reasoning for working with the wollastonite. Then what we have done since is that we have tried to use wollastonite on different soils, different crops, under different conditions. And the one important distinction that we've made in our experiments is that sometimes we work with leguminous plants, and then sometimes we work with non-leguminous plants. And what we've seen over and over in various experiments is that whenever we have the combination of wollastonite and a leguminous plant, we see more accumulation of inorganic carbon. And I'll tell you a little bit about how we found that and why that is in the next few slides. So first of all, the very important thing about the application of wollastonite or any silicate in an agricultural soil is the synergy that you get between the plants, the soil, and the mineral. And then most importantly is that when you have a leguminous plants tend to acidify the soil because of the nitrogen fixation activity. So nitrogen fixation involves bacteria that fixate nitrogen. And in that process, the plant roots actually release organic acids into the soil. And we believe that that's the main effect of why we see better results with leguminous plants. Those acids help to dissolve the silicates more quickly, and therefore release the calcium more quickly, and therefore we can see that happening more readily than when we use something that is non-leguminous. The other very important aspect of this is that when we are dealing with calcium being released from wollastonite, our hope is to be able to find the calcium carbonate. Of course, there's always two ways of looking at weathering. So sometimes weathering forms solid carbonates. Sometimes weathering simply forms soluble bicarbonates. And whenever you have the opportunity to actually look for solid carbonates, it's easier to verify what is happening. And what we have found through both experiments as well as geochemical modeling is that the soil conditions that we have here in Ontario, combined with the climatic conditions, make it very suitable for the formation of calcium carbonate in soil. And so we have relied predominantly on the detection of that precipitated calcium carbonate in soil, rather than trying to study, say, the leachate from the soil. We do in the future intend to go more towards studying leachates and soil solution and movement through the groundwater, because we see that as a long-term mechanism. We don't assume that those calcium carbonates will stay in the soil for very long. So eventually we would like to be able to track the movement of those carbonates in the soil. And let me move on here. So first I'll show you a few results from our very early experiments. In our very early experiments, what we did is we planted soybean and corn together with wollastonite in pot trials, right? So these are not field trials, or there were pot trials done in our university. The main result that we saw from those pot trials was that synergy between the wollastonite and the soybean. And you see that in the middle here. It's MSA means a mineral amended soil, and bean means soybean. And that's the one experiment that gave us the highest inorganic carbon accumulation in soil. And it also then resulted in the highest total carbon accumulation in soil. So those were the experiments that basically encouraged us to go and do more studies. So we did these pot studies as our first trial, proof of concept. Once we saw some encouraging results, then we wanted to understand why this was happening, and then also then scale it up to eventually go to field trials. We didn't see as good results with corn. The corn basically didn't acidify the soil enough, so the wollastonite didn't weather enough, and so there wasn't much accumulation of inorganic carbon with corn. Then what we did in a subsequent year, and I think this went from 2017 until 2019. In the subsequent year, one of the trials that we did was we wanted to study different amounts of wollastonite in soil to find the ranges that work best. So we wanted to find what is the optimum amount of wollastonite that you can put in soil, and we also wanted to see if there's a limit. So how much can you put? What's the maximum amount you can put to get beneficial results, and beyond that value, what happens? So what we did is we tried a range of dosages from 1.5 to 20, and I forget now what the exact unit of this is, but that's the dosage of the wollastonite in soil. And with no plant, we basically see not much weathering. So the first result here is no plant, no weathering. Once we put our soybean, then we see weathering, then we see calcium carbonate accumulation in soil, and it's proportional to the amount of wollastonite up to a certain point, and then it starts to stabilize, which we associate with the pH getting a little bit too high. So if the pH gets a bit too high, the weathering slows down, and so you don't accumulate as much carbonate. With green bean, we saw a continual effect up to this level of 10 here, and green bean likely was able to acidify the soil more than soybean, and so we managed to keep up that good benefit of adding more wollastonite. Then when we saw these results with soybean and green bean, we ran an additional trial with alfalfa. The reason why we went for alfalfa is that alfalfa is a common cover crop here in Ontario. And if you talk to anyone who works with organic carbon sequestration, they very much push the idea of using cover crops. So again, we're trying to find synergies here in the farm. So one synergy that we're finding is that ability to go soybean corn on rotation. And so the application of wollastonite is most likely more beneficial when you apply it in the soybean year than if you apply it in the corn year. And then the other one that we see is that the cover crop, because alfalfa is also a leguminous plant, it enhances the weathering of the wollastonite. And not only that, but actually alfalfa likes to grow at higher pH. That's why we even went up to 15 of dosage, saw even more inorganic carbon accumulation, and then finally saw a big detrimental effect at 20. And we associate that detrimental effect on the, not so much on the plant growth, but mainly on the inorganic carbon accumulation, because the pH is higher, but also on the plant growth because the nutrients are not as plant available when the pH gets a bit too high. And you see that in this picture here. So here we have a picture of the plants that were grown under these multiple amendments. And we see that the plant liked best the condition at around 10. So when we went to 15, it started getting smaller. And when we went to 20, it started getting smaller. If we look at the root development, also it was a little bit different depending on the dosage. So we verified with this experiment here that there's likely going to be an optimal dosage of silicate for particular silicate in particular soil for particular crop. So that's something that we need to keep in mind in the future, that it's not about just putting more and more, it's about putting the amount that is most suitable, both geochemically, but also for the plants. And what I was saying before was that the big advantage of using wollastonite is that ability to find evidence of the weathering and of the carbonate formation mineralogically, right? So we can actually find the carbonates. Here's an example. So on the top picture, I have our wollastonite. There's pretty much no carbon in the existing wollastonite, especially if you do a spectrum of a single needle of wollastonite. When we look at the wollastonite needle that was recovered from the soil after a plant growth experiment, then what we see is we see calcium, we see carbonates accumulating on the surface of the wollastonite. So this is something that we're still trying to study. We're still trying to study whether the carbonates with wollastonite are forming still attached to the wollastonite, or does some of it actually dissolve into the solution and form as new particles. That's something that we've had to put on hold a little bit because of the pandemic, because we for example, are not able to access our SCM even until this point here. So once we did those experiments, and I forgot to mention, when we did these experiments with the different dosages, we already went from pot scale to microplot scale. So we have a microplot here at the university, and we actually grew them in a microplot. Then finally, we went to the farms. So this was in 2018, 2019. We identified 3 farms in Ontario that we could do the experiments on. One was a soybean farm, another was a potato farm, and then another one was a leafy vegetable farm, which is basically is a lettuce. And we ran different experiments in the different farms. Essentially, in the soybean farm, we ran a planned experiment where we tested different dosages of wollastonite and compared against a control. In the potato field, it was the farmer themselves who did the wollastonite application, and they did also half and half, so half the field with wollastonite, half without. And in the leafy vegetable field, it's a field that actually had been using wollastonite already for 3 years. So even before we started working on wollastonite for enhanced weathering, some farmers in Ontario have already been using wollastonite because they see beneficial aspects for the plant growth, for the soil health, and so on. So we went to this farm to look at how has the weathering occurred over the 3 years that they have been applying those minerals. And sort of one snapshot result of these field trials was that when we looked at the soil, one of the difficulties when you do farm work is again to find that evidence of the carbonate formation, especially because you're looking at lower dosages, you're looking at longer time scales. So it becomes more challenging than in the lab to find the evidence of the carbonate formation. So one thing that we realized is that if we sieve our soil and analyze different size fractions, we actually find the carbonates accumulating in the pan fraction, in the finest fraction of soil. So that was one way that we try to enhance our ability to detect the carbonates. Then just a little bit of a summary of the field work that we did. In the field work that we have done so far, I think we have seen 3 main results. One is that the amount of inorganic carbon accumulation is proportional to the amount of wollastonite that you put in the soil. So we saw that in the soybean farm. The more wollastonite we put in soil, the more inorganic carbon formed. The second important result that we saw is that wollastonite weathers relatively quickly. Right, so this field trial that we did in the soybean farm, this was within 1 year. So wollastonite was applied in the spring. The farm was harvested in the fall, and then we went in the fall and did our second sampling. So within that period of 6 to 8 months, we already saw enough weathering and enough carbonate formation to be able to make some positive assessment of the results. In the potato farm, we saw the same thing. We saw wollastonite versus no wollastonite, more inorganic carbon. In the leafy vegetable farm, what we found was that accumulation does carry on year over year. So after the first year, there was less inorganic carbon. After the second year, more. After the third year, more. Right. So those are the key messages. When you use wollastonite, the weathering is fast. The more you put, the more inorganic carbon you'll see. And then the more you wait and the more you apply, the more inorganic carbon will accumulate in the soil. And so I'll just end my talk here, and I'm probably over time, but I'll just end my talk sort of with a little story of some of the challenges that we have faced. The biggest challenge that we continue to face, even up to today, is that there's still this perception with people in agriculture and soil scientists that carbon in the soil is organic carbon. It's very difficult to explain or to find someone who is aware that inorganic carbon is also an important fraction of soil, and it's even more difficult to convince someone or to make them aware that if you put silicate minerals in soil, you will enhance the inorganic carbon formation in soil. And one of the reasons for this is that there is still a lot of perception that weathering in agriculture means to apply limestone. You apply limestone in the soil, oh, that's weathering of mineral. So to reverse that, right? So instead of applying the limestone, but forming the limestone in the soil, it's a complete 180-degree turn. And so we still face a little bit of this difficulty of making the message go out that there is this additional opportunity for soil carbon sequestration through enhanced weathering, through the formation of pathogenic carbons. But that is going to be slowly changing, because the more field results and experiments that we do and we publish, the more people will be aware about what we're doing.